The next step is applying plaster to our styrofoam. And you can see that I have scored the top of the styrofoam using just a regular wire brush. I've cleaned the crumbs off because, again, we don't want those styrofoam crumbs getting mixed in with our plaster. I'm wearing gloves because I think anytime you can prevent chemicals from being on your hands is a good thing. But also because we're going to be smearing this plaster on this styrofoam. I don't want to get it, and this plaster has been mixed very densely. So we're going to be using it really when it's on the brink of setting up. And so we're going to have to dig in there, and I don't want to get it under my nails and in my nail bed, and it makes your hands dry, et cetera, et cetera. You'll notice that I put a plastic bag over my container here. Because we are using plaster that's really on the brink of setting up, it's likely going to dry in the container. And if it's a container that you plan on reusing, then this plastic bag will prevent dried plaster from sticking to the walls of your container. So my plaster is really getting close to that point where I can form peaks that tells me that, you know, you don't want to put it on a flat surface and just have it run off. I am working on newspaper because this probably is going to get a little messy, but you can see it's almost like whip topping or cake frosting. I feel like I always use food similes. I don't know if that's really a simile. Analogies, comparisons. All right. Very close. Start by getting it off of my fork there. It's a little liquidy yet. Our plaster's gotten a little bit thicker, so I'm going to go ahead and start applying it to the form. So I'm just going to start by scooping it out. If it runs through or out of your fingers, then you might want to wait and let it set up some more. But the idea is that I'm applying a coating of plaster on the styrofoam so that when it sets, it will be just like any other plaster mold. It will have a nice absorbent surface so that you won't ever have to put any kind of barrier like we learned in the previous episodes, like plastic or cornstarch. When you are applying your plaster for this particular mold, I want it to be pretty smooth. So I'm kind of spreading it out. I think my plaster's still a little soft to try to put it on the side of the form without it just puddling. And you got to be really thoughtful when you're doing this because you don't have a lot of working time. If you've worked with plaster, you know that once it's made its mind up to set, then it's going to set. So it can add texture to your plaster. However, remember that in any kind of mold making situation, you want to try to avoid undercuts or those areas that are going to hang on to your clay. It's starting to set up pretty well now in my container, so I'm going to start adding it to the sides of my form here. And it doesn't have to be super thick. You want it to be thick enough. We are going to go back and sand and refine. So you want it to be thick enough to be able to sand it without getting back down into your styrofoam. So maybe err on thicker if you're going to have a lot of sanding to do. You also want there to be enough thickness that the plaster can absorb the moisture in the clay. So if you just have an eggshell of plaster, it's going to get wet with the moisture from the clay fairly easily. And then the clay is not going to pop from the mold probably the way that you would like it to. You certainly could get some tools involved at this point if you would like to smooth that surface. You can do quite a bit of smoothing as your form or as your plaster is setting up. Look for areas that you might need to fill in or build up. Again, not everything has to be smooth and even because you're going to do some refining. However, if you have a thin spot, then to even that out, you would have to sand or rasp everything down to that thickness. And if it's too thin, again, you're going to have issues with the plaster getting too wet when you were trying to make your mold or make your casting from your mold, I guess. It's really starting to set up now, so I have super limited time. So I'm going to try to get the center built up nice and even. It is a little bit like a frosted cake here. Okay, you know when the plaster is starting to crumble that it's probably finished. Now, if you find that when you are finished with this that maybe you went too thin on an area or you, I don't know, get a hole somewhere, you could mix up a little bit more plaster and try to patch it, but it's unlikely that it's going to be a very strong attachment or permanent attachment. Did a much better job on my left side than I have here on my poor right side. But that's okay because I know, again, I'm going to go back in and refine this a little bit. So because I mixed my plaster in my bowl here with a bag, I can just remove that and everything can go in the trash.